We're back, and this time we're going to talk about tree structure and tree growth, so the physiology of how trees can grow. So let's look at our slides here to help us understand this as we go through it. So first of all, we're going to start with thinking about tree growth in terms of the leaves, but we'll do a little bit of introduction before we get there. So first of all, here is a view of a tree from a forester's perspective. So some of these terms may be familiar, but some may not be. So we'll start over here on the left, and the crown of a tree is the part of the tree that has leaves, and in the conifer trees that we primarily have in this area in Nevada, those are needles. The leader of the tree is the top of the tree, and in the branches that go out to the side, those are called branches or lateral branches. And then as we come down to the trunk, that's also sometimes called the bole of the tree. The base of the tree is called the butt of the tree, and the butt experiences butt swell. So it's often wider than the trunk of the tree, just a few feet above the base. And then, of course, below ground, what we can't see as well are the roots. There's an enormous amount of root mass down there. Often 50% of the biomass or the material of the tree is actually below ground. And we can particularly see these roots exposed when trees blow down or fall down, and then we can see what's called the root ball. So anyway, these are some familiar terms and maybe some new terms, but these are kind of forester language for trees. And then some other things I want to mention is we can often observe how trees are growing and how fast they're growing because they grow in a particular pattern where they add layers or whorls of branches each year. So on the right-hand side, you can see a zoom in of a branch, and you can see that each year, two branches are kind of heading off the main branch to the side. And then 1 year back, there was a set of branches that grew off the main branch. And now, because that branch is 1 year, those little branchlets are 1 year old, they have branches that are coming off them. And then going back before that, there was another branch. So we can kind of see how fast a tree is growing, and in some cases count how old certain growth is, or maybe the whole branch or tree is if it's a young tree. And the same principles apply when we are looking at a whole tree, and that a whorl of branches that comes off the main bole of the tree grows each year. And so we can see how fast the tree is growing, and in a young tree where there hasn't been a lot of self-pruning of the lower branches, we can actually count the age of the tree. And of course, this works well in conifer trees. It doesn't work well in tropical trees that don't have seasons, or in other broadleaf trees that don't really have this kind of linear, center trunk that has what's called apical dominance, or kind of dominates the growth of the tree. So in order for trees to grow, some growth basics that are probably not a surprise to any of you are that trees all need sunlight. So they need this visible light spectrum energy that comes from the sun. They also need water, which they primarily absorb from the soil. They also need nutrients, which they primarily absorb from the soil, so both organic and mineral nutrients. And then they also need different kinds of gases like CO2 for photosynthesis and oxygen for respiration. And they absorb those either from the air into their leaves, or from the soil into their roots. And so you can see soil is a very important pathway through which plants get materials. And so we're going to talk about soil in a few weeks. Okay, so we're going to start out in this lecture and kind of focus on the leaves of the trees, or the crown of the tree that contains the leaves. And remember, for conifer trees, those are primarily needles. But the main job of these leaves, and in this case needles, in the case of the tree, is to perform what's called photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is the conversion of CO2 and H2O, or carbon dioxide and water, to sugar and oxygen. So CO2 plus H2O equals C6H2O6, which is the chemical symbol or formula for glucose, which is a simple sugar, and oxygen. And this glucose is then the energy source, or essentially the food source that the plant uses to burn inside itself to get the energy it needs to grow and do other plant functions. So basically, this is a unique property that plants have where they can capture energy from the sun, and they can take that kind of inorganic form of energy and they can convert it into this organic form of energy in the form of glucose, and they can store it as a chemical form of potential energy that they could utilize in the future by breaking the bonds in the sugar to release energy. Interestingly, this photosynthesis is completed by a pigment or a protein that's called chlorophyll that's found in chloroplasts, these special cells in plants. And that's what gives plants their green color. So you may know that. And then another important structure on plant leaves that allows them to do this photosynthesis are stomates or stomata, they're called plurally. And this is basically like a little valve that's shown in this picture on the bottom right, and it lets CO2 in during the day, but then it can also be closed up to prevent water loss, which is something that plants are constantly thinking about. They absorb a lot of water, soak up a lot of water with their roots, and are constantly losing the water through their stomates and their leaves out to the atmosphere. So at certain times of day or at certain times of year, they might shut up these stomates to try to keep as much water in as possible. So why are these chlorophyll pigments, or the leaves and then in general green? Well, interestingly, that's because green is the type of light energy that they can't use. So visible light comes in a variety of colors that have different wavelengths, and red light has broader wavelengths, and blue and purple light has shorter wavelengths, and the different kinds of chlorophyll in plants can absorb light and utilize light in the red and orange area of the spectrum and the blue and purple part of the light spectrum, but they really can't utilize energy from the green and yellow part of the spectrum. So they send that energy back. It's kind of like a waste product, essentially, or waste energy that is bounced back and picked up by our eyes, which is why they look green. So the leaves come in different forms, different plants that grow in different environments, and then even different leaves that grow on the same tree in different parts of the tree might have different structures of where their like chloroplast cells are, or how their other plant cells are structured. And generally plants that are in the sun have thicker leaves with more cells packed together and kind of inside thicker structures, whereas plants that grow in the shade or leaves on a tree that are in the shade tend to be thinner. And this is kind of for two reasons. One, plants that are growing in the sun are exposed to more UV or ultraviolet radiation, which can be harmful to plants. So the plants or the parts of the leaves that are in this highly exposed area are trying to protect cells in the inner part of the plant, and they're also often just oriented away in a way as they're standing up in the sun that tries to kind of minimize the exposure of ultraviolet light, whereas the leaves that are in the lower canopy do not have that concern. There's not as much UV light that makes it down to that part of the canopy. And then in addition, the plants in the upper part of the tree have plenty of light coming in to do photosynthesis, so they're not trying to spread out their cells to capture as much light as possible, whereas the plants in the lower canopy really need to try to get as much light to all the cells as possible, or all the cells that can do photosynthesis as possible, in order to maximize their ability to grow. So sometimes on the exact same tree, the same species, there'll be leaves that look completely different. And these two photographs on the left are both from a redwood tree, but the leaves on the top are called sun leaves, and they have these very short spiky needles that are limiting their exposure to ultraviolet radiation and are still able to get plenty of visible light for photosynthesis. These grow in the top of the tree, and then the leaves that grow, or the needles that grow at the base of the tree, maybe hundreds of feet below the canopy or the top of the tree, are going to look totally different because they are growing in a way to spread out to capture this light. So this brings us to a concept in tree physiology and growth that's called compensation point. And to understand this, we need to remember that plants photosynthesize, something we've already mentioned. They use up carbon dioxide and water to make sugar and oxygen. But what's often overlooked about plants is that they also respire, just like animals and fungi and bacteria and other life forms, and that they take that sugar that they made through photosynthesis and then they burn it with oxygen inside their cells to fuel their different metabolic processes, their growth, their cell healing, and other things like that. So they need to be photosynthesizing, making sugars faster than they're burning these sugars if they want to be able to continue growing. And so this concept of compensation point is the light that's required for the rate of photosynthesis to match the rate of respiration. So when the light that's available allows the plant to photosynthesize at the same rate that it's respiring, it's at its compensation point. And this is different for different plants that grow in different environments and different for different leaves on the same plant that are growing on different parts of the tree. This graph below shows the compensation point here in the middle. And for this particular leaf, it's at a certain light intensity that looks to be about like 400 foot candles of light intensity. And if there's less light than that, then the respiration rate that's going on in the plant is greater than the photosynthetic rate. And so it's burning, the plant's burning its reserves. And then if there's more light than that, then the plant can photosynthesize in excess of its respiration and build up energy and grow. So this is what's meant by the compensation point. So, as I mentioned before, not all plants have the same compensation point or have the same light requirement, and not all leaves within the same plant have the same light requirement because it depends on the different kind of cell and plant structure. So, some cells are designed to break even with lots of light, and some cells and some plants are designed to break even with lower amounts of light. So these sun leaves, for instance, shown in this graph here on the right, as increased light exposure occurs throughout the day, they can increase their rate of photosynthesis to a quite high photosynthetic rate. Whereas these shade leaves can increase their exposure to sun throughout the day, and they might not have the capacity to photosynthesize at the same rate that the sun leaves have. And then, as we'll discuss in a minute, these two might be breaking even at different points too. So to explain this in a little bit more detail, certain plants may have a very high potential to photosynthesize well, like these sun leaves have the structural capability and the physiological capability to photosynthesize really quickly when they are exposed to lots of light. However, there's a cost to that, and that these plants then usually have really high background R or respiration rates to maintain all their quote unquote photosynthetic equipment, or the different kinds of cells and multiple cells and cell structures that allow them to photosynthesize quickly when light is available. So a sun leaf may be able to photosynthesize quickly when there is a lot of light, but then it's probably going to be respiring more quickly as well. So it might have a compensation point that is at a much higher light level, whereas the shade leaf might have a lower ability to photosynthesize, but then it might have a lower rate of respiration. So it might be able to meet its compensation point at a much lower light intensity. So this kind of brings us to an understanding of different life history strategies that different leaves on the same plant or different plants in different parts of the forest canopy might have. And I like to think of the two basic life history strategies as the Honda Civic model and the Ferrari model. So first of all, the Honda Civic model is basically what happens for plants that are tolerant of living in these low light conditions in the understory. So these plants have modest photosynthetic equipment, basically not too many cells or not too complex of cells that allow them to photosynthesize. And because they have a more modest set of physiology, they don't require as much energy to maintain that same physiology. So they can't photosynthesize that fast when the sun is exposed. However, even if they're not in a lot of light, and even if they're not photosynthesizing that quickly, they'll have a good chance of outpacing their low respiration rate. So they may have not a lot of expenses, which allows them to kind of have an income that's greater than their expenses, or kind of like a greater fuel efficiency and car efficiency, which is why I'm giving it a Honda Civic label. So this is different than what I'm calling the Ferrari model, which is kind of how understory intolerant plants like a ponderosa pine that really can't grow very well in the understory are. And so in this case, these plants maintain lots of cells that can photosynthesize very quickly when sun is available. However, because they maintain all these cells that allow them to photosynthesize so quickly in the sun, so a ponderosa pine out in the sun can grow a lot faster than a different, more understory tolerant tree like a white fir can grow. Because it has all that equipment, it's also all the time burning lots of energy or respiring very quickly for the upkeep of these cells. So that's great when there's sun and there's enough photosynthesis happening to meet its compensation point. But if the sun goes away, then this plant is going to really struggle and probably potentially die. So understory tolerance is just kind of one of the kinds of environmental tolerances that plants have to deal with as they're growing in a community amongst other organisms. And understory tolerance is related to, of course, the limitations of light that we've been focused on, but there's also potentially limitations in water in the understory. But other kind of tolerances that plants might have to deal with would be drought tolerances, just general lack of water from periods of time with limited inflow of water through rain. And so the picture on this slide is extensive tree mortality in the Southern Sierra that's caused because of drought, also caused because of fire suppression and overstocking or overdensity of trees in the forest. And then those things combined have allowed bark beetles to come in to these stressed trees that can't fight off the beetles and kill lots of trees, which then make these forests really susceptible to fire. So it's kind of a downward spiral that we'd like to avoid. And then we can also think about fire tolerance and then cold tolerance. But these are other topics that we'll get into later on in the semester when we're thinking more about fire ecology. But I just want to bring them up when we're talking about light tolerance and say that's not the only thing that plants are dealing with as they're trying to navigate their way through growing. So one last thing I want to mention about kind of tree growth in the context of leaves is that sometimes we'll see trees with split tops. And what's happening in this case is that there's been a disruption of a particular type of meristem tissue in the tree. So a meristem tissue is a type of undifferentiated tissue from which new cells rise, kind of similar to like a stem cell for a plant. And there's lots of different kinds of meristem tissue in trees. There's apical meristem, which is the meristem tissue that's at the very tip of the leader of the tree in the crown. Then there can be lateral meristem, so at the tip of the lateral branches. Then there can be root meristem, so at the tips of the roots. And then there's also vascular meristem tissue, which we'll talk about in the next section here. But in this case, what happens is that the apical meristem, the meristem tissue at the very top of the tree, produces auxin, which is a plant hormone. And this plant hormone is then kind of moved down to the lower parts of the tree, and it goes out to the lateral branches and the buds on the lateral branches, and suppresses the upward growth of these branches. So they are going to grow outwards rather than going straight up towards the sun. However, if something happens to that apical meristem tissue that's producing this growth, kind of disrupting hormone called auxin, like wind blows the top out of a tree, or an insect comes along and kills the top of the tree, or somebody chops off the top of the tree to form a Christmas tree, or an animal munches it. There's a lot of things that could happen. And when that happens, then all of a sudden the lateral branches surrounding the top of the tree will no longer be suppressed by this auxin. And so then they'll turn upwards and they'll start growing towards the sun. And eventually, usually one, but sometimes two or three or even four of these will all start to then produce auxin that they send down to the other lateral branches to get them to stop competing. But in that case, we'll be left with multiple tops of a tree rather than one top of a tree. And that could be good. It could form a good nest kind of nook for certain types of animals. But of course, it's not desirable when we're thinking about lumber production. So anyway, just want to mention that in this section where we're kind of talking about the crowns of trees. All right, that is our stopping point for now.